So now I would like to introduce our final session of the day, our closing fireside chat, how the economy shapes our job attitudes and self-concepts, in which you'll hear from a professor who's doing a lot of fascinating research at a beloved and prestigious Atlanta university. So please welcome to the stage Emily Bianchi, PhD, Goizueta Term Associate Professor of Organization and Management at Goizueta Business School, Emory University. And this will be moderated by Steve Koepp, our very own, from day one, co-founder and chief content officer. So welcome to the stage, Steve and Emily.
Hey, everybody. So at the end of our events from day one, we love to bring on someone has some fascinating new area of research, something that is provocative, and in this case, bringing really fresh insight into what shapes the behavior of workers and customers. So I'm honored and delighted to be talking with Professor Emily Bianchi of Emory University's Business School about what she discovered about how economic booms and busts that we go through really do affect and have an influence on attitudes that people have about their jobs and their lives. And this does have a takeaway for people who are managers of other people in terms of what makes some people tick. So great to have you here,
Thank
Emily.
you so much. Great to be here.
The first question is, could you give us a kind of an overview of what you discovered?
Sure. So when the economy tanked in 2009, I was in graduate school. And at the time, an article came out by an economist, and it got a whole lot of press. And it showed that people who graduate in recessions earn less, and that they have less prestigious careers, even decades after that first experience in the job market. And as a recession graduate myself, I could relate to that. But I also wondered, would there actually be positive implications? Yes, we know that they earn less. We know that they're, in terms of career success, they're not quite as successful as boom graduates. But is there sort of a silver lining? Are they more satisfied with their jobs? Are they more grateful for their jobs? And so that spawned, what has now been over a decade of research looking at the effects of graduating in a recession, non-monetary effects. The monetary effects have been pretty well established, but does it matter if you first looked for work at a really challenging time when it was very, very hard to get a job? And do you hold that with you for a really long time? And at this point, I can confidently say yes, that when you first really struggle to get that first job, that we see, decades later, that these folks are more satisfied with whatever job they hold, even though it might pay less or be less prestigious.
Wow. So this line, you mentioned that this was triggered by an article, but that it also resonated in your personal life and even with your differences in your attitude and your siblings? Sure.
So I graduated, I was in college during the late 1990s and graduated ultimately in 2001. But I often think about 1999, and 1999 was a year that Alan Greenspan described as the greatest economy the world had ever known. So if you remember back to that time, we had record unemployment, we had this dot-com bubble, right? It just seemed like the economy was going up and up and up, and it didn't feel like there was ever going to be any end. And I remember in college being a sophomore and going to career fairs. And at these career fairs, it was, companies basically vying for new graduates, right? And so they would give you all this great swag, and you'd walk away with Frisbees from pets.com, and it just felt like they were all kind of vying to get you. And so I remember people graduating in that year. I was only a sophomore, so it was kind of more of an onlooker. But people graduating in this year, there was really a sense of, who's going to offer me the best package, and am I making the right choice, or should I have gone with this startup instead of that one? And it was just a very different mentality for the folks in my class who graduated 2 years later when the bubble had burst. When, now it looks like a pretty mild recession, but then it felt very big, and it was really, really hard to get a job. So I remember going to the the career fair my senior year, and there were probably a third the number of companies, and many were, not hiring, and they were just, giving us information about them in case they would hire in the future. And, a lot of my peers we had a really hard time getting that first job. I cobbled together stuff for the first year out of college. It was a year, after my graduation date that I first got health insurance. And I remember kind of the joy and relief of that moment. And it was just so different than, the folks who had just graduated 2 years earlier. And so that really kind of spawned my research interest in this topic.
Did you even see signs of, like, with people maybe coming out of school a couple of years earlier, maybe family members, friends?
Yeah,
family?
so I have two older sisters, and they graduated in the go-go 90s, in the boom years of the 90s, and just have approached work very differently than I do. So to give an example, one of my sisters was recently kind of going to take a little career pivot, and she was totally comfortable leaving her job, taking a little bit of time to figure out what she wanted to do, and then, choosing a new one. And to me, that was unfathomable. The idea of leaving a job before another one was lined up and I think that's largely because of my experience of how hard it was to get that first job. The idea that I would leave something and not have something else was just mind-boggling to me. It worked out for her, and, but I really think that a lot of that is from those very different first experiences we had.
So then how did you turn it into, turn to the science? What was your methodology in terms of digging to try to, show that these inklings that you had were real?
Yeah, so generally in my research, I look at, these huge government data sets that often have been collected over decades. We have some, there's this survey called the General Social Survey that has been collected since the 1970s. And so you can just get year after year after year of responses from a representative sample of Americans from all walks of life, from all regions of the country, from all different types of jobs. And so using this really rich data, I was able to kind of, isolate the various factors and look at kind of how bad the economy was doing when people first entered the workforce, and use that to predict how satisfied they were with their jobs today. Mm-hmm.
So for the people in the audience who are in HR or talent acquisition, should they really be looking at, like, this person seems very entitled, I wonder when they graduated, and looking back at the year? I mean, do you see a real difference in 2 years to, the next?
So I don't know how to answer the first part of the question, but yes, right. You do see a real difference. So, you're alluding to kind of the narcissism finding that I have, which is that people who graduate in recessions are less narcissistic. And I find this in a whole bunch of different data, and it's been replicated by other social scientists. And part of that was actually born out of starting my academic career in the Great Recession. And when I started, I was expecting to encounter these really entitled students. Like, I had just heard about this generation, and the stories out there aren't really positive. And I was really struck because they weren't that narcissistic, right? Of course I had a couple, but generally I was really, they seemed actually quite humble. And which made me think, maybe, young adults are really, really hit hard by recessions. They have very few job experiences. They come out into the workforce. They don't have a whole lot to offer. And when the economy goes south, a lot of times companies start cutting there, right? They cut new folks, or they don't hire people, coming out of recessions or coming out of college. And so you see kind of the unemployment rate really spikes for young people during recessions. And that's a pretty humbling experience. And so reading about people's experiences during the Great Recession, a lot of people were describing, moving back home because they didn't have any other choice. Taking jobs that didn't require a college degree, taking jobs that they had held maybe even summers in high school. And that's pretty humbling, right? So the idea that those folks would then go on to become, a narcissistic generation doesn't really make a lot of sense, because we know that hard experiences tend to reduce the likelihood of narcissism, right? Because it's hard to think that you're special, unique, and entitled when you can't land a job, when you can't support yourself, when you can't, make your way in the adult world without a significant amount of help from your family. And so in my research, I find that yes, people who graduate and have those, on average, really pretty tough experiences, humbling experiences, are less narcissistic as older adults than people who don't have that experience.
Is there an element of the first impression here, which is maybe not scientifically proven, but that their first encounters with these things just leave a bigger impression than if they'd had a little time to have some savings or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the question is, why would this matter for such a long period of time for these young people, and it doesn't seem to for people who are in their 30s or 40s or 50s. And the reason is, and there's a lot of work in this field that suggests that early adulthood is a very formative time for people. So if you're going to change, say, your political beliefs or your religious beliefs, it's most likely to happen at that period of time. And the reason is because you're leaving kind of your family of origin. You're sort of making your way in the adult world. You're sort of navigating it on your own. And the conditions present at that time can shape kind of who you are and who you become. And so I think a lot of people can relate to the anecdote of, people who grew up in the Great Depression, right? So if you had grandparents who grew up in the Great Depression, you may have seen them as older adults be incredibly frugal, even when they didn't really have to be, and be incredibly risk averse with money, right? And so that period of time, right, that formative moment when they were kind of navigating the world, shaped who they became later. And so, yes, I do think it's especially with work, that's really when you're first navigating your first job, your first full-time job, when you're first kind of making sense of how that's going to work and what to expect and what the world might offer you, all those sorts of things.
I want to get to what the takeaway could be for our audience in terms of business. But before, are there any other examples of this in terms of how these people were shaped in terms of starting a family, buying a home, taking risks?
Yeah, so definitely in terms of risk aversion. So there's been a lot of research on that in financial risk aversion, not just from people who grew up in the Depression, but even people who came of age in the recession of the early 1980s. Those folks tend to, on average, be more risk averse than people who came of age even a couple years later. So that is the most well-known finding, and I think the most robust finding. In terms of home ownership and stuff like that, I mean, we're seeing huge generational differences. I'm not sure that we can totally isolate the effects of recessions on that.
Okay, so for the audience, what can business leaders learn from this in terms of doing something that might be a little counterintuitive or not following their usual impulses under the economic conditions at play?
Yeah, so I kind of think there are two implications for organizations. The first is, there tends to be general risk aversion during recessions, and for economic reasons, a lot of people can't hire during recessions, right? But some companies can. And I think that companies that can have a real opportunity at that moment to snatch up some really fantastic people. That you're going to have people who are eager to work, who are going to have a sense of gratitude and loyalty to a company that might not be true in another time when you're vying for those people. So the attitudes of those folks coming in might be more positive, and your ability to kind of get the cream of the crop is also heightened at that point too, because there's less competition. So I often think of that as a tremendous opportunity for organizations that can do it in bad economic times. Mm-hmm. I think another implication is to think about, sometimes these recession folks, they have, gaps at the beginning of their resume, right? They have, they've had a tough time, right? If you talk to people who, especially in the Great Recession, those folks really struggled for several years. And so sometimes their resumes don't look as fantastic as someone who graduated in better economic times. But again, I think that poses an opportunity for organizations to snatch up some really good people who might not have the same kind of experiences that they would have had they graduated in a more fruitful job market. But again, could be really fantastic contributors to an organization.
And then you think some of the benefits would be in terms of commitment and bonding and engagement and things like that?
Yeah, all those things, right? So definitely commitment, right? Versus kind of always looking over your shoulder to see if there's something better out there. Feeling kind of grateful, kind of invested in the organization, wanting to give back to an organization that you feel has given something to you. Those are all sort of positive workplace behaviors that organizations are often really interested in cultivating.
So now we're going through a period that it's not just the up and down economic cycle. There have been, the Great Resignation, pandemic, social justice movement, and now, like as we were saying, people saying they don't really like work anyway in general, and we're all turning French and trying to have new perspective, keep working, off to the side of life. So where do you even begin to approach such a complicated time?
Yeah, so right now is a cauldron of, of various factors that have not been present in the data that I've looked at to date, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a really interesting time, especially, early in the pandemic, the economy was doing terribly, so I would expect sort of the same effects that I've described so far. Mm-hmm. More recently, the economy has been doing really well, at least in terms of the unemployment rate, and so but there's still this pervasive sense of uncertainty, right? There's this pervasive sense that like another wave could take us over, and we could be back in this really terrible position, and so that's different than most times when the economy is doing well, right? In the heyday of the 1990s, it just felt like we were on top of the world, like nothing could go wrong. That's certainly not the aura right now, right? So this is a really interesting period in that you have great economic figures, but also this pandemic that's making us really feel uncertain and unpredictable. So to answer your question, I don't think we know yet how that's going to play out. That we'll really have to, wait 5 or 10 years to kind of see how all of this plays out in the data.
Okay. You have another line of research that involves economic conditions. So in the time that we have left, could you explain this fairly complicated proposition, which is, but fascinating to me, which is about how economic conditions affect people's attitudes about individuality versus community? I may have not have described it exactly right, but it's
yeah. So I can give you the kind of airplane view of it. So we all know that Americans are very individualistic, right? So if you look cross-culturally, when you look at individualism compared to other countries, Americans score higher on it than any other country in the world, on every metric I've ever seen. And over time, there's been a lot of data suggesting that it's gone up. So when you look at the lyrics of our songs, they become more I, me, myself focused and less us, our we focused. And a lot of that has to do, when you look cross-culturally at which countries are individualistic and which are more interdependent or collectivistic, a lot of that is predicted by the state, by economic situation, right? So wealthier countries tend to be more individualistic. And it makes sense because how can you be really individualistic, try to stand out, do all those things, unless you have some economic independence? Because when you're, if you think about being, really poor, you have to rely on other people to kind of make things work. You might have to try childcare with a relative, or you might have to have somebody help you, fix your sink or fix your roof or things like that, right? So there's much more of that interdependent by necessity sort of element. So I wondered whether when you see fluctuations in the economy, do we become even more individualistic during good economic times? Because there's that feeling of invincibility, there's that feeling that things are, we can just do anything, and more collectivistic during bad economic times. And indeed, I find that we do. So when I looked at things like what we name our children, do we give them really unusual names or do we give them more common names for our area? What music we listen to, do we listen to music in Billboard top 10s that are very I-focused? So I often think of, R. Kelly's I Believe I Can Fly, which is a very individualistic song if you think about it. There's a lot of I, me, my, right, in that. And then that was from the late 1990s. And more collectivistic songs like Celebration from the recession of the early 80s. And so we see this in the data that songs are more kind of I, me, my focused in good times and more us, are focused in bad times. And we see this across other metrics as well. That's the one that I personally found most exciting. But across all these different metrics, we see this move towards collectivism in bad economic times. And for a while I thought, do you want me to talk about the racial part of it?
Sure.
Yeah, so for a while I thought, well, wow, this is kind of this great element of recessions, right? We all know that recessions are really tough and they have all these negative implications. But maybe this could be like one small silver lining, right? That Americans become a little less individualistic. And so for a while I thought that. And then the more I thought about it, and the more I read in the research, well, interdependence has some great benefits. One of its many problems is that countries that are more interdependent also tend to have more negative racial attitudes towards outsiders. So there tends to be more xenophobia, there tends to be more harsh laws against immigration. And so thinking along those lines, I thought, well, if we become more interdependent during recessions, do we also become sort of have more negative views of people of different races? And so when my colleagues and I went back and looked at data from Americans from the 1960s onwards, and we found that indeed they do, that especially white Americans' perceptions of Black Americans become more negative during recessions and more positive during good times. So this, interdependence seems to have a pretty dark side of making racial relations or racial attitudes more negative.
And so for companies, the takeaway might be during tough, stressful economic times, maybe they should, in terms of their DEI commitment, stick with it?
What's that?
Don't back off, don't cut.
Yeah, so I think, it's in recessions, you can imagine kind of diversity initiatives, many kind of things like that, getting scaled back. And this research suggests that they're actually more important during those times, right? It's actually a time to double down, not a time to kind of, ease up.
Can you tell us, we're out of time, but just any headlines about what you're planning to do next, or would that study next, or would that be a spoiler?
No, I have a lot of things I'm looking at. I'm looking at kind of how recessions graduates are more likely to volunteer, how they're more pro-social. I'm also continuing to unpack kind of these, the racial attitudes research and looking kind of at different aspects of that. But there's a lot, and as the pandemic, as time goes on, I'm planning to look at kind of how this affected young people who, graduated in 2020, who graduated in 2021, how that shaped them for a long time. But that'll have to wait until they're a little older.
Yeah, I'd love to know the science behind, what spending a year and a half studying at the kitchen table had on my teenage boy who, missed the whole season of basketball. Maybe it made him stronger. But anyway, thank you. It's so fascinating to hear about how what makes us tick. What makes us tick. And so thank you, Emily. These were really new ideas to me. And that concludes our program. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. Venturing back out into the real world. As they say, I feel a vibe shift going on, and so thanks for being part of it. And the bar is open. So thank you. And the fish are swimming.